actually start while people are still joining the webinar. Yes, let's start now. So let me start by welcoming everyone from across several continents and time zones to this Agrarian Change webinar, organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS University of London. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS and from the Journal of Agrarian Change, and I'll be chairing the session. I'm also joined by two Journal of Agrarian Change co-organizers, Sreya Sinha from Queen Mary, University of London, and Enrique Castagnon from the UCL. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming two speakers, Dr. Jasper Abimbia Ayelazuno, Associate Professor of the University for Development Studies in Ghana, and Dr. JS Ovadia, who is Associate Professor of the University of Windsor in Canada. Jasper's research is concerned with extractive industries, democracy, and contentious politics in Africa. He is also engaged in social justice activism in Ghana and is the author of the book, Neoliberal Globalization and Resistance from Below, Why the Subalterns Resist in Bolivia and Not in Ghana, published by Routledge in 2019. Jess's research focuses on the political economy of resource extraction and development in Africa. He is the author of the book, The Petro-Developmental State in Africa, published by Hearst, 2016. Among the many articles, they recently published a joint paper in the Journal of Agrarian Change related to the topic of today's talk. The title of Jasper's and Jess's talk today is Ocean and Land Grabbing in Ghana's Offshore Petroleum Industry, from the agrarian question to the question of industrialization. After the presentation, Liam Campling from Queen Mary University of London and also a Journal of Agrarian Change editor will provide some initial comments to start up our discussion. Liam's research interests are wide-ranging and includes the political economy of international fisheries, global value chain and natural resource industries, and labor regimes and global production. Okay, all that's left for me now is to remind you that the webinar is also live streamed on our YouTube channel, and you can post comments and questions in the live chat there and also here on Zoom at any time. Also, we're recording the session. If you don't wish to be recorded, simply don't use your audio and video. And you can find the full program of our webinar and seminar series on our website, Agrarian Questions. With that, let's start today's program. Jasper and Jesse, over to you for the next 50 minutes. And I think it is you first, Jasper.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and thanks, Zan, for the introduction. We are really happy to be here, and we are happy that people have joined, and we look forward to a very insightful and fruitful discussion. So as Zan has illustrated or just indicated, our topic is on the offshore petroleum industry in Ghana. Just the next slide. And we try to look at it from an agrarian political economic perspective, which so far has not been used to analyze the offshore petroleum industry in Ghana. This talk, as Zen has indicated, is based on a recent article that was published in the Journal of Agrarian Change. And on this, we want to acknowledge the comments and of the three anonymous reviewers and the editors of the Journal of Agrarian Change, as well as specifically Carlos Oya, who was the chair of a panel in which the ideas for this article were originally or first tested. I want to also acknowledge the support of three research assistants in Ghana who helped in the fieldwork, Abdallah, Stanley, and Arish. Next slide. So we'll proceed in this way. We'll locate the talk in the new development thinking in Africa, and then we'll go to state our main argument, and then talk about how data was collected for this talk or the paper. And then we'll then zoom in on what we describe as ocean graphs and land graphs. And then we'll then apply our reconceptualized and reformulated Agrarian question, which is the industrial question and the industrialization question, to the Ghana offshore petroleum industry. Next slide. This paper and the research is situated in what is described as the new development thinking, which is commodities-led industrialization. This is the new development thinking that has emerged in Africa following the refutation of the new liberal development paradigm, which has been practiced in Africa in the last 3 decades without actually moving the economies of these countries forward, let alone bringing about industrialization. As a result of that, scholars like Joseph Stiglitz, Hans Jun Chang, and development agencies in Africa like the African Development Bank, the AU, African Mining Vision, and the Economic Commission for Africa began to talk about how Africa can actually industrialize based on their commodities rather than exporting them as raw materials. These development agencies and scholars are beginning to talk about the revival of the project of developmentalism led by the state. So this is the context in which this paper and the talk is situated. So this is also connected to the blue economy. Next slide. The blue economy, which African states are beginning to see as the new frontier of African Renaissance. So it's not just about extractive industries or commodities that are extracted on land, but they are also looking at the ocean as the new frontier of African Renaissance. So you have a situation where Africans are beginning to think of industrializing on the back of their commodities, including commodities that are extracted from the ocean. So is this development paradigm straddles resources both on land and on the ocean. Yet when it comes to agrarian political economy and its insights concerning the organization of production and social relations of production in agrarian formation and how they are related to power and power relations and property relations, this has not actually been applied to the ocean-based extractive industries, and for that matter, the blue economy of Ghana. So in this paper and in this talk, what we try to do is to reconceptualize the agrarian question. And this is not something, and then apply it to the ocean. And we draw on the work of Kaplan and Havers, Kaplan and Collas, who have indicated that actually the insights of agrarian political economy can actually be applied to the ocean and ocean resources and capitalist accumulation on the ocean. So the recent book of Kaplan and Collas really gave a history of how even the ocean, there's a notion of property ownership of the ocean, and how relations of production and capitalist penetration in the ocean have been part of the history of capitalist accumulation. So this, following this approach and this new scholarship in agrarian political economy, we reinterpreted the agrarian question. Rather than agrarian, we try to reconceptualize it as industrial and industrialization question, putting focus on what Bernstein described as the problematic of production and the problematic of accumulation, in trying to also, in his formulation of the agrarian question. Both of these formulations are talking about production, concerning about capitalist, the transformation of social relation of production in the agrarian societies, and how that transformation leads to the development of productive forces, and how the productivity in agriculture will be channeled to industrialization to promote industrialization. So based on this, we decided to, based on the work of Kaplan and Collas and Elizabeth Havers, we decided to stretch these concepts to apply to this offshore industry, because it is also part of capitalist accumulation in Africa, just as agriculture, as in the case of land grabs, is part of capitalist accumulation. So that's why we have this in the topic, from agrarian question to the question of industrialization. So we are not suggesting anything seminal that we are trying to do, but we are only trying to advance agrarian political economic analysis based on work that has already begun in the Journal of Peasant Studies and then the Journal of Agrarian Change. Next slide. So here, the blue economy here is not just limited to oil alone, but here our focus is on oil, which is becoming where the ocean is becoming the new frontier for oil capital, all rushing to Africa too. So you see this, the ocean that is along the coast of Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, all these have become places that oil capital is searching for to extract and produce oil. Next slide. So this is this illustrates the oil capitals that are in Ghana and the offshore industry. You can see that along the coast of Ghana, you see that that is the oil companies, and then the wells that are being drilled in the ocean. Next slide. We illustrate that this is a rush by global oil capital, by these oil companies. These oil companies are transnational oil companies that are all in Ghana, trying to explore, and some are already producing oil and gas. Next slide. So clearly, there is capital accumulation in the ocean, which calls for the application of the agrarian political economic perspective, as Kaplan and his co-authors have been doing. So where do we get the issue of dispossession and grabbing? Because before the oil industry, these communities that are located along the coast were already reproducing themselves with on the ocean through small-scale fishing, and combined with farming inland. So here you have a clash or a conflict between the new green blue economy, that is oil production, and the old blue and green economy. Next slide, which is the small fishing fishers. They fish on the same ocean that you have this new oil industry. So marine fishing generates approximately 1 billion annually and accounts for 2.6% of Ghana GDP. So this marine fishing, over 90% of it is done by the production is done, or the fish is caught by small-scale farmers who not only sell it, but they use it as a food and source of protein. So next slide. So clearly, the same ocean and the same land that is required for these oil companies are the same resources that these coastal communities have dependent for their livelihood, and for that predated the oil industry by several centuries. So you see in this map, you see that there is this blue economy, or the hydrocarbon production. You have the pipes that are laid from the ocean to the land and to the inshore communities, Abuaji, and then you have Sanzule, and then Atobo. All these are inland communities and leading all the way to secondary Takrady. So there's a connection. This industry is based on both sides of the terraqueous, that is both on land and then the ocean. Next slide. So our suggestion here is that this clash is illustrated by several enclosures, including the no fishing zone that is on the ocean, and a ban on fishing around the reefs and many areas inland that have to do with places where the basis for these oil companies. So not only do you have grabbing on land as a result of this inland, there are bases and then the pipelines that are laid, but you also have what? You also have a situation where on the ocean, these fishers have been banned from fishing around the place where the oil is being drilled, around the rigs, around the ship that are transporting the oil, and they have come into conflict with many the security agencies of state. So there's always a conflict between the fishers and oil companies. And this has led to many incursions by the canoe fishermen into the safety exclusion zone. So we are wondering whether one of the questions, agrarian political economic insight that we are seeing from these incursions is a kind of, we are seeing it in Angel's political approach to the agrarian political economy, which is the way in which those that are dispossessed are probably resisting the state and the oil companies through their incursions. I think at this point, I will hand over to JC to take us to the next, to the end of the talk.
Great, thanks, Jasper. So what I want to focus on in the talk today is the actual empirical material we collected on dispossession and dislocation when we did our field work. We did our largest piece of field work a few years now ago in 2015, where we visited each of the 6 coastal regions in the Western region and conducted interviews and focus groups with fishermen and other interested stakeholders. And I think what we generally found was that there is an inherent conflict, over the usage of both land and ocean. And that's one of the main messages, obviously, of our paper. it resembles in some ways, at least closely enough, that we can use some of the tools of agrarian political economy that were first used to understand capitalist transformations around the world, to understand what is happening here with the oil and gas industry in Ghana. And you know, the Ghanaian state is using the oil and gas industry, the blue economy more generally, as Jasper discussed, to extract surplus. And that surplus, ideally, you know, in theory, could be used, and we're hoping will be used in some positive ways in order to spur industrial transformation. But our primary concern, while we're you know, excited about that possibility, is also to present some of the impacts. And the impacts, as Jasper mentioned, are very severely felt by peasants, by farmers and fishermen across the Western region, and in their livelihoods, because both the land and the ocean are crucial for their social reproduction. So we talk about land grabbing, and more centrally, we talk about ocean grabbing. And we discuss that since the state is really at the center of the petroleum industry in Ghana, that this is a form of dispossession or accumulation by dispossession, to use Harvey's term, that occurs through legal means. And that's something that other scholars such as Frank Nobeng Odumobeng have discussed. We talk about, you know, grabbing or enclosure when it comes to the ocean in particular ways, right? Because in the first instance, there isn't one single owner of the ocean, as there is often with land, but there are multiple users of ocean territory, and the oil industry in many ways, as Jasper laid out, denies those prior users access to and property rights over over the space and over the resources that they require to reproduce themselves. We talk in the paper about a few different ways that we can conceptualize that. We use a lot of work from Anna Zalek, from Campling and Colas, and from a number of other scholars that have sort of laid the foundation for trying to better understand ocean grabbing and control of the ocean, which is really what this is about. And this quote that you see on screen from a fisherman we spoke to in Esiama really captures this idea that the fishermen often feel that they have property rights over the ocean territory that they use for their livelihoods. And they understand this as a conflict that is emerging with the oil companies, with the Ghanaian state, in particular because the Ghanaian Navy often uses violence in order to enforce the zones of exclusion. And this, you know, we're concerned not only has an impact on the livelihoods, but also creates a situation of greater conflict in the coastal regions of Ghana. We go back into the history in our paper of ocean and land grabbing, or land control grabbing, we call it, in Ghana. This is something that has occurred previously basically throughout Ghana's recent history. Ocean grabbing in particular is often been associated with, you know, large European industrial fishing vessels coming into Ghana's inshore exclusion zone and sort of you know, taking control and overfishing and affecting the livelihoods of artisanal and small scale fishers. This has caused over time a depletion of fish stock. There's a lot of debate, including scientific debate, over what exactly has caused depletion of the fisheries in Ghana. Obviously, the oil industry is a fairly new industry. So in our research, a lot of the fishermen are largely blaming the oil industry for that. But regardless of whether that's actually the case or not, we know that their livelihoods have been negatively affected. We know that there are all these areas of the ocean that they're no longer allowed to enter. And what we heard over and over again from fishermen is that for various reasons, the fish are attracted to those zones of exclusion. Obviously, there's no fishing occurring there. There are also maybe bright lights and other things attracting fish to those areas, and that's part of the struggle. There is also, as Jasper suggested, a struggle over land in the Western region, because the oil industry requires large amounts of land for the transportation and storage of oil and gas. So we discussed the conflict over first land and then the ocean. We talk about the construction of a Ghana gas processing plant and a large pipeline in the Western region. And the impacts that has had. We also discuss, and this may be familiar to some of you who are aware of some of the difficulties with land tenure in different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We also discuss the issue of inadequate compensation and the legal mechanisms by which the Ghanaian state is able to expropriate land and do so based more on the estimation of the valuation of crops rather than any sort of value or compensation for ownership of land. So I won't say anything more about the land grabbing. I want to focus on the ocean grabbing that we've discussed and the relationship to communal notions of ownership and access that we've sort of established are predominantly held in the Western region. I think maybe I'll give a couple more quotes. There's another group of fishmongers, which are largely the women involved in processing the fish, who also told us that it's not only the depletion of the fisheries, the reduced catch, there's also a phenomena they've noticed of smaller sizes of fish being caught, and that has an impact on their businesses as well. They're in a very good position to know that, since they're the ones involved in processing, smoking the fish, and then bringing them to market and selling them. And this created a great deal of anger. It's created, as I suggested, conflict with the Navy. There have been, we interviewed people who told us they were beaten on different occasions and not able to continue with what is their main source of livelihood. And it is actually quite a large area of land. I want to emphasize that is a no fishing zone. There's a smaller zone of exclusion right around each of the main installations. And as Jasper showed, there's a growing number of installations in the oceans in the western region of Ghana. But there's a larger advisory zone that the Ghanaian Navy is patrolling, and where there can also be conflict over access to the ocean and its resources. There's a, as I mentioned, a view that the ocean belongs to the fishermen who use it for their livelihoods. That's something we found not only in that one interview that I showed you, but across the study area, where fishermen generally believe they have customary collective property rights, and another fishmonger in a European town, which is a community in Sekondi, said, quote, we are those that are living just by the sea, have nothing besides the sea. It would be wrong if we think that it is not ours, it is ours. And other people who talked about this in terms of, the sea is from God, and God has given it to us. We're born by the sea. We're bred to use it. So there's a lot of language like that we also encountered in our research. And when fishermen and fishmongers believe they have a claim to this territory, and they feel harmed by the oil and gas industry, whether or not that harm is real, they're looking for compensation. The oil and gas industry is trying to engage on different levels with the community, and that's a very contentious process. It's one that often leaves the majority of people feeling like they haven't had their needs met. They haven't really been listened to or heard. The kinds of either corporate social responsibility or social investment that we see from the oil industry is not really going to address the loss of the main source of livelihoods for a majority of people in these regions. There's a couple more quotes. I'm not going to read them all, where we show, the fishermen talking about their disputes with the Navy, the fishermen talking about their experience of the state intervening and limiting their access to the ocean. I mean, on the one hand, it may seem like the ocean is a vast place, and it shouldn't be such a big deal if certain areas are off limits for oil and gas production. But that's sort of a misleading idea, we argue, and we still do focus on these instances of dispossession, dislocation, the impact it has on livelihoods. What we heard over and over again is these are very real impacts. And we explore them not only in this paper, but in another paper that we co-authored with Jamie Van Alstyne, where we focus even more on the rising tensions, the conflict, and the social dislocation caused by the oil industry in the western region and coastal communities. So I think I'm going to go to just talk about the link to industrialization a little bit more, and the industrialization questions. Make sure that we have that focus in our talk today. We want to note that, first of all, there are opportunities that are created by the oil and gas industry, and we're very interested in that. As Jasper said, we're interested in the possibilities for industrialization and for resolving the industrial question of capital in Ghana. We are interested in who is capturing these opportunities. Right? That's the second big question. What is happening with this surplus from the oil and gas industry that is being appropriated? Who is appropriating it? Who is benefiting from that? And then we're thirdly interested in the labor processes of the petroleum industry, and whether there's any kind of compensation for the loss of livelihood and for the loss of the ability to reproduce themselves in the coastal communities. Now, for our work, we end up focusing a great deal on local content policies that the Ghanaian state has put in place for the oil and gas industries. These policies are, I like to think of them as similar to or an expression of what Ha-Joon Chang calls activist industrial trade and technology policies, right? The policies that are meant to promote infant industries, use of tariffs, use of state-directed research and development, reliance on state-owned enterprises in order to foster industrial development. And it's natural, given the prominent role of oil and gas in several West African countries, that local content policies in oil and gas would organize the state's role in promoting economic development. And this is part of a larger process, as Jasper mentioned, of bringing the state back in, of a new development thinking that sees a place for the extractive industries in creating economic growth and industrialization. So the Ghanaian state put in place its local content policies, its framework, basically by borrowing from a Nigerian law passed in 2010, and setting targets for local participation in various oil services, goods provision that the oil industry requires. So the oil industry itself is obviously not a very large employer and has most of its linkages outside of Ghana, but it does require a great number of goods and services in order to carry out its activities. And the idea is that if more of these activities can be, more of these goods and services can be supplied by local companies, those companies, would have assistance in developing. They would be able to develop links outside of the oil industry as well and into the non-oil economy, and that would further industrialization in the country. That's an idea that we are initially very excited about. I think I don't want to speak for Jasper on this, but I've lost some of my optimism that this approach will be successful in Ghana and in other countries in West Africa that have tried to follow it. But I think whether or not they end up working in practice, they wouldn't have, even if they worked the way they were supposed to in theory, fully address the development needs of communities like the communities that we were doing our research in. Because ideally they would create some industry, some new jobs. Those jobs wouldn't necessarily be for those people though that were experiencing the dispossession, right? They would be more in the capital, in the biggest industrial cities, in Ghana's case, like Tema. They wouldn't actually, in the short or medium term, address larger questions of economic development. So they can only be a small part of how you would resolve the problem of industrialization. Something else that I want to talk about here. We talk about whether the surplus that is extracted stays in the country or not, where it goes and who benefits from it. We talk about how local content policies could work in theory or on paper, and then we argue that there is a space for a strong developmental state, a petro-developmental state, as I've talked about in my other work, to foster industrialization. But at the same time, we have a great concern, and these intersectoral linkages, are very difficult to build. They, as much as Ghana's local content law sounds good in theory and practice, there are a lot of challenges with its implementation, with the idea of taking this kind of a strategy for state-led industrialization. And maybe we can get into more of that in the questions. I think I'll turn over back to Jasper to give us some concluding thoughts, and just end by saying that there is a crisis in the social reproduction of farmers and fishermen and people's livelihoods are linked to their actions in the western region of Ghana. Whether or not that crisis was caused by the oil industry is very much entangled in that crisis now, in an ongoing process of proletarianization that obviously predates the oil and gas industry as well. And that's part of what we're very interested in exploring in this paper.
Okay, so I'll just come in and then tie the paper together and the talk together by way of conclusion. So basically what we have tried doing here, drawing on work that already have begun by pushing the boundaries of agrarian political economic analysis to the ocean. We feel that just like the industry on the ocean or the blue economy, you have the agrarian political economy can be applied usefully to this, the ocean, just as Kaplan and his co-authors have been doing. So the social relations and dynamics of production and reproduction, property and power relations can all be investigated in this offshore industry. Bernstein, even though they didn't apply this to the extractive industries and to the ocean, his 4 theoretical questions that are often quoted as the focus of agrarian political economic analysis: who owes what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it, can all be applied to the petroleum industry offshore in Ghana. And of course, the dynamics of agrarian change often confined to agriculture and land, such as class and gender differentiation, division of access to land, division of labor and division of the fruits of labor, property and livelihood, wealth and poverty, and power relations are all insights of agrarian political economy that can actually be applied to the blue economy in general, and particularly the offshore hydrocarbons industry in Ghana. So our contribution is in the reformulating the agrarian question to industrial question. Just as you have the industrial revolution, you can also have an industrial question. Just as you have industrialization or the green revolution separate from the industrial revolution, you can also have an industrial question and an industrialization question, even though they are connected. Because certainly agrarian political economy shows that agraric surplus can be drawn to promote agriculture, yet you have these 2 terms used. And as a matter of fact, Bias in one of his has stated that actually the term agrarian is a bit misleading, because the history of industrialization shows that actually resources that were drawn to promote industrialization were not just from agricultural produce. You had minerals like coal that were also used, and just like the book of Kaplan and Carlos illustrates the way in which similar capitalist accumulation and even primitive accumulation as it is in land also happened on the ocean. So what we have tried to do here by applying this, by reconceptualizing this question, agrarian question, is that when it comes to industrialization in Africa, it cannot be resources from agriculture alone. Africa is grappling or has been struggling to industrialize despite the penetration of capital and capitalism in its countryside. Penetration that started centuries ago. Paulie Hills illustrated this in the 1960s when he was writing about rural capitalism in Africa. What she did was that she actually went further beyond land to analyze fishing and small-scale fisheries on the ocean, which is not the case when it comes to the agrarian political economic analysis. And so with this, we are able to look at the possibilities and then the challenges, because as JC pointed out, the state is very important here. In the classical agrarian political economic analysis, the state was very important in drawing the linkages, in channeling resources from agriculture to industries. As the work of Akram Londi and Kay have indicated, even in the East Asian newly industrialized countries, it took a different form, not by dispossession, but the state has to channel funds through taxation from the peasants to industries. So similarly, this shows that given a capable petro state, as JC defines it, the foreign capital or foreign oil companies provide opportunities for the state to squeeze, to industrialize. After all, energy is the motto of industrialization. Every industry needs energy to operate. So given a capable state, just like you need a capable state in the classical agrarian political economic analysis, where the state has to channel resources from agric to industry, the similar thing can be done. So based on that, we are able to actually analyze the challenges and the prospects of the Ghanaian state doing that, which, like JC has pointed out, looks a bit problematic, because so far many challenges with the local content policy, good on paper, but it has not, in terms of implementing, the state is not doing that. So as a result, most of the oil that is extracted is exported, as our respondents told us. They don't see the oil. It's exported straight from the ocean abroad. And this is clear from the Navy chasing away fishermen because they were blocking the road, or I mean the area or the space that the ships pass to ship the oil from Ghana abroad. So that means the state is actually not making those linkages. And for that matter, the problem, again, a bigger challenge is the capacity or the quality of a petro state in Ghana to actually draw this linkage, because these oil companies are powerful, and a weak state or a state that has a corrupt political class will not be able to withstand their power. So these are some of the things we are looking at. And of course, we are looking at this from agrarian political economic perspective. We don't see these dispossessions and graphs as something peripheral to the industrialization agenda of the Ghanaian state or any African state, because as Carlos Oya pointed out, and many scholars of agrarian political economy point out, development is very awful and it involves some pain. So we even though we are critical scholars and we want to take into consideration the moral aspect of this dispossession, what we try to do here is to freeze the moral aspect and just to analyze the possibility of industrialization based on the offshore carbohydrate industry by looking at it from this objective theoretical perspective. And by doing that, we can make some conclusions, even though the oil industry is still young, but it looks like the state that is required to forge these linkages between the oil industry and the broader other sectors is not doing that at the moment. And with that, I will leave it, and then we can take your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jasper and Jesse. That was really interesting and actually quite wide-ranging. I mean, of course, it's all empirically focused in one area of the world, but the topic is theoretically, empirically, and politically extremely wide-ranging. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, but it's not for me to start that off. That is for Liam Campling, who I'll hand over to in a minute. Before that, let me just say that I can see the discussion has already started, both in the chat. We also have people already raising their hands, and that is what, of course, we would like you to continue to do after Liam Campling's initial comments and responses from the presenters. Over to you, Liam.
Thanks, Jens. And I don't want to speak for too long because I can see that there's a lot of colleagues here who want to talk to, and I think it's a kind of a wider-ranging conversation. It's better than me ranting on. But I just want to start off by saying thank you to Jasper and Jesse for such a wide-ranging paper. It's unusual to, in this age, the age of increasing specialization in academia, we're increasingly in our little silos to find the space to be able to connect the dots. And that's what you're doing in this paper. You're bridging a very wide set of kind of social relations and political and kind of policy problematics. And so I think that's an important contribution. So thank you. And I wanted to start off how you started off, actually, briefly, which is this question of how to leverage, and it's actually how you conclude your paper as well, the very last line. It's this question of how to leverage natural resources in order to, kick off industrialization and so on. And, you're talking about Stiglitz and Chang and so on, or although they were perhaps less focused on that particular problem and more about industrialization more broadly. But the question of natural resources is, of course, crucial to your story. And this natural resource-led development strategy throws up a number of contradictions. And I'll kind of start from there. And the first contradiction, I guess, is for labour and between different segments of the labouring classes. And within that, I'm including the small-scale fishers and those employed in the oil industry and those benefiting from kind of employment in the local content arrangements as a result of the kind of oil industry strategies. And of course, those Ghanaian fishers who are also working on the big distant water industrial fishing vessels, and those working in factories in Ghana processing that fish caught by foreign boats, which is another strategy of the kind of the blue economy. So what this all throws up is quite a difficult set of possibly contradictory relations amongst different workers or labouring classes. It also throws up a number of ecological kind of problems or contradictions. On the one hand, the ecological basis for small-scale fishers and the social reproduction of kind of communities on shore. But presumably some of those communities on shore may also be benefiting from the oil industry in some way, and you have some kind of interspersal there. And the contradictions that are then thrown up, of course, by the digging of oil, the mining of oil, the extraction of oil, which of course is probably in the long run, or even the medium term, going to undermine the very conditions of existence of those same coastal communities as a consequence of global warming and sea level rise, and storm surges and so on. And so, what's kind of the problem here, I think, from the kind of the strategy of accumulation is how to overcome these. And then the second kind of question is how to think about that analytically, how to think about these kind of contradictory kind of sets of relations that are interconnecting through different industries, dependent upon different kind of natural resources, but articulating in similar landscapes. And so I'm using landscape in the sense of Don Mitchell here, the kind of Marxist geographer. And so just coming back to this idea of the state, which is kind of central to your framing, and the exclusive economic zone. And I think that one of the things that might get lost by those who aren't immersed in the world of state property in the oceans is that coastal states fought hard in order to win in the law of the sea the exclusive economic zone as a space by which they could exclude foreign fishing interests. And the exclusive economic zone and the area are basically areas of sovereign rights for coastal states. And those sovereign rights are really important mechanisms for doing exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is the utilization of natural resources to try to industrialize, despite the contradictions that I kind of started out with. And so that historical prism is important. And the particular moment in which that was negotiated, the world historical moment, is also crucial. And that's the 1970s. So the call for a new international economic order, the call for general third worldism, the non-aligned movement, and so on. One of the key demands was precisely to push out multinational corporations and to utilize natural resources for developing countries' own kind of development, rather than this kind of standard strategy of kind of appropriation and kind of more simple manufacturing if you're lucky. And so one of the questions then emerges, this is the kind of third set of problems, is around small-scale fisher interactions. And so, you've identified the kind of the contradictions there and the difficulties there and the role of the state in policing and committing acts of violence against small-scale fishers, kind of very common problem globally. But at the same time, there is this problem of the Ghanaian state wanting to be able to utilize access to fisheries in order to create raw material, to bring it onshore, to create jobs in cities. And again, this is why your prism is so useful, because you're getting beyond simplistic kind of fetishizations or populist kind of positions on the countryside, and you're thinking about this articulation, I think, very, very, very strongly in your paper. And so it's just to drive that home just a little bit more. And that's the question of who owns the fish, right? So the state kind of owns access to the fish, and coastal communities have historical kind of customary rights, right? Which you were talking about in detail, kind of customary communal access, I think you called it. But the question then is, in those coastal communities, does everyone have equal access to that fishery? Or are there also hierarchies within those coastal communities and within those small-scale fishers? Or is it just, some kind of communal kind of utopia of everyone shares this kind of access equally? Which raises another kind of question, which is the question of social reproduction. You talked about Western Ghana and women processors and traders, and that's the case, globally, but especially in West Africa, women play that kind of role. To what extent are they at the front line of these contradictions? Who's absorbing these crises, the crisis of ever smaller fish, and what are the alternative mechanisms of social reproduction that are available to them? And then, of course, that's probably a big question. But what it throws up, is in my last 2 points, is the idea of the terraqueous, right? So where land and sea meet. So getting beyond this kind of simplistic idea of the sea being somewhere else and the land being something else. I mean, you talked about this very nicely when you were talking about the need for the offshore oil firms to absolutely need land onshore in order to maintain their operations. And that's the same for, all at sea operations. And so what that throws up then is these kind of contradictions again for jobs, food security, and different types of jobs. There's also, I think, the final point, this kind of last question that you raised, and I don't it's a very difficult question, which is the ultimate capture of the surplus sloshing around from all of this economic activity. And you kind of hinted at this. And you hinted at this in relation to the use of local content and your pessimism around that, and I share that pessimism. Of course, there's some possibilities from that. It's not to denigrate the possibility of local content as a tool, but of course, multinational firms are multi-jurisdictional, highly sophisticated political actors that are able to play around with that very, very effectively, as we know. So the final kind of question is, apart from the rents that we know the state can capture in the form of access to the fish from the blue economy, or access to the oil in the seabed, and the kind of the concessions that the state leverages there, what are the other points at which Ghana is using these natural resources in order to capture kind of domestic value? And I think that's a kind of difficult one, because if we just follow the commodity, which of course we tend to do because it's relatively easy, the more problematic one is following the wealth and following the money. And so that's exactly where the multi-jurisdictional strategies of big corporations have the advantage over states like Ghana if they're acting by themselves. So that's the kind of point, I suppose, around regionalism. I'll leave it at that. And thanks again for a great paper.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks for complicating the picture even more. And so, whereas the presenters tried to make it simple and clear, we now have the all the nitty-gritty difficulties that has to be part of the picture as well in here. So over to you, Jasper and Jess, and we don't expect you to answer every detailed comment and question. You pick from this the points that you wish to engage with, because I think that's the best way. But so thanks a lot, Liam.
Okay, I would just thanks Kathleen for those insightful comments and difficult questions. They actually will serve as the point of departure for further research as we continue to observe this offshore petroleum industry and the prospects of industrialization in Ghana. These are really comments that we can take, and that will inform further research into the industry, drawing on the Agrarian political economic perspective. Talking about the contradictions, the conflict between different classes of fishers and different classes of workers is certainly a very important area to look at from the Agrarian political economic perspective, even though we didn't actually investigate that part. And I think, Jen, you do a lot of work on labor as well as Carlos Oye on these issues. So labor relations and class relations, the way in which different fractions of workers might be struggling against each other. Already, this was already present, even in the fishing industry, the small-scale fishers, and that connects to the conflict that even preceded, because the small-scale fishers are not certainly a monolithic class. Actually, there is you have different classes. You have even, it is arranged in such a way that you have the capitalist owners of the boats who employ workers to fish for them. So all these are important issues to look at. And of course, the ecological aspect is also there, because these oil companies are flaring gas, even though some of the gas is being used to process gas for use domestically and for generating power. There's a lot that is being flared. And of course, they are using sophisticated machines and like rigs and ship that are carrying this oil. They will be discharging all kinds of pollutants into the ocean. And unfortunately, the Ghanaian state is incapacitated to actually even monitor the extent to which these spills, or possible even to monitor oil spills and these forms of pollution. So some of the problems that our respondents talked about were environmental in nature, the way in which they thought the seaweeds, whether it's true or not, they are beginning to see seaweeds that their nets are being entangled in. That used not to be the case. And they are beginning to see whales that die. All these cannot be blamed on the oil company alone, but at least from their perspective, all these issues are problems that are caused by the oil company. So with this, I'll leave it to Jesse to probably address the other issues raised by Kathleen.
Okay, sure, thank you. There's a lot there. I think I'll start, Liam, the way you did, by this question of how could you leverage natural resources for industrial development, and what are the contradictions in doing so, right? That's a really interesting starting point that we also rely on quite heavily. And I think, as you pointed out, we're trying to grapple with a lot of big questions that are not often addressed in this kind of work. A bigger question that sort of looms behind that question is something that I think there's been a lot of debate about in Marxist political economy, which is particularly when it comes to study of Africa, whether you need to have industrialization and capitalist development in order to then transcend capitalist development, right? And I think posing that question helps us to come to terms with this idea that there are positives, there are potentials in these new industries, in foreign capital coming and investing, and in surplus being extracted in new ways. We focus on the oil and gas industry, but there's as some of the questions have alluded to, as Jasper alluded to, a larger blue economy, multiple ways to think about benefiting from oil and gas, and more importantly, the linkages. What I would say about that, since it's very central to a lot of my research, is that whether or not it's required, we do think that there is potential in capitalist development and in industrial transformation. We do think that this is a positive development when people are employed in these industries, when people are employed, as you mentioned, in factories processing fish, when they're employed by those industrial fisheries as well. We haven't seen a great deal of jobs in those areas. That's a common critique, but I've always felt that there is at least the potential for a good number of jobs to be linked to, in particular in our situation, the oil and gas industry, and we think of that because we think of the potential in the various goods and services that are required. So I don't know if this is also partially an answer to Bridget and some of the other questions that have been asked, not specifically to how we define industrial policy, but in the idea that there are multiple ways in which you could set not only targets, because that's not necessarily the most effective way. You set targets, you also incentivize. Hopefully the state incentivizes foreign firms to domicile more of their activities in country, to procure from local companies. Those companies then, develop their capacity to do a wider range of activities in the economy. So if there's a company, providing IT equipment, they can hopefully start providing IT equipment, to other firms and more broadly in the Ghanaian economy. If there's a company providing more specific tasks for the industry, like drilling or highly specialized equipment, maybe they can find ways to do that in other parts of the world, but they may also find non-oil applications, drilling for water in Ghana or something like that. So we do think there's a possibility for a large number of jobs to be created in these industries, but part of the contradiction is that is something that I think I've called elsewhere a dual nature to these policies, to local content in general, that it has that potential. It also has the potential to facilitate elite accumulation. So your question, Liam, about, are communities benefiting from the oil and gas industry? I would think of it not so much as communities benefiting. It's hard to think about communities in the Western region really benefiting on the whole, but certainly individuals are benefiting. Individuals across Ghana and certainly abroad are benefiting, and that's something that we're very interested in. We don't focus so much on the hierarchies of access to these resources, customarily, but I think that's a really interesting question. We do, sort of think about more broadly, if there is discontent in these communities, is it really directed at the oil industry, or is it directed at elites, at people that they think might be benefiting and not cutting them in? And that's something we talk about, and some of the quotes that we pull out are really focused on that. And last thing I think I want to say from your comments is about this idea that multinational corporations are actually multi-jurisdictional. They're able to move around. That's one of the issues standing in the way of local content policies, industrial policy more broadly. One of the reasons that I first got interested in the oil and gas industry, and that Jasper and I think this is such an interesting industry to study and to theorize, to build upon an agrarian political economy, is because it operates a little bit different from a lot of other industries. I mean, the extractive industries as a whole is a bit different because those resources are in the ground or in the ocean in a specific place, and you can't necessarily just move somewhere else, pick up a factory, move it to another fiscal or regulatory regime, right? Particularly with oil, and what we find interesting about oil is how central it is to the global economy. To the world's militaries run on oil. Oil, drives basically every global value chain from beginning to end. So and the resources in the ground, as you mentioned, are the property in most cases of the states directly. So it creates more opportunities for industrial policy. Certainly, we were thinking about this, more than a decade ago, at a time where industrial policy was just being talked about again after an era of neoliberalism, and so we saw some potential there, and that potential, I think, isn't, doesn't allow the state to just tell multinational corporations, these are your targets across the board, meet them and create industrial development for us. It creates an opportunity maybe to think strategically about building new forms of comparative advantage in particular industries, and having an industrialization plan, and then working with the multinational companies, international capital to further that plan. And I think the big reason that this approach has failed in Ghana and elsewhere in West Africa for sure is because that hasn't happened. So maybe I'll stop there and we can go to some more of the questions.
Thanks so much. And we can all see that there is a fair few questions in the chat, and we'll return to them in a minute. First, I'll ask Chintiba to step forward and ask his question or comment.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I think they've been excellent in elaborating on some of the issues they found in Ghana. And I followed their studies from their 2015 study, which set the stage for some of these recent findings. Now, I just want to find out from the authors, because from the presentation, I'm seeing some kind of similarity to the colonialism that Africa witnessed. Because with most of the companies that are more or less in the blue economy, you realize there's a certain pattern of foreign interest in those areas. And so I just wanted to find out from the authors whether they see a relationship between the current blue economy and that of, having some kind of political economy with respect to the colonial footprints that Africa witnessed in the past, and with Ghana as the focus, given the dynamics that is happening within our sector, because you see that government or state steps in to protect these people to protect the oil companies, against the fisher folks who may be encroaching the zoning areas. And this is similar to the era where the chiefs were also used as people who were more or less fronting for the colonial masters in engaging with the communities. And so I just want to see whether they see some kind of similarity in terms of what is happening there and that kind of colonial footprints that Africa witnessed. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to you, Jasper and Jesse.
I'll leave that. My chance is a lecturer at my department. I'll leave it to Jesse to address. He's in UK there doing his PhD. It's good that you joined. But I think I'll take a few of the questions that are sent by on the chat link, and one of them is from Bridget Olekla. If I pronounce your name wrongly, we came across your work and we actually agreed with Olekla's argument that there is no single paradigmatic approach to agrarian change in Africa, not even a Marxist one. That was one of the quotes that we took seriously, and that gave us a kind of inspiration. So it's good that Bridget, you have joined us, and your question has to do with whether there's actually an industrial policy in Ghana that is connected to the oil industry, and besides just trying to capture rent. And I think, yes, on paper, yes, the local content policy has many policies that are aimed, or many instruments that are aimed at drawing on the oil to promote industrialization in other sectors. For example, trying to refine oil refineries, reserving some of the work that has to do with fabrication and other things for Ghanaians, and many other aspects of the oil industry, both upstream and downstream, are viewed to be jobs that should be reserved for Ghanaians. So on paper, they have these policies in there, but as we indicated, in practice, these policies are more observed in their failure to implement them than implementing them. You also indicated that probably a comparative politics of the Volta Dump, probably looking at the politics of the Volta Dump and industrialization under the Nkrumah government can give us some ideas about the politics of the offshore petroleum industry and where it is going in terms of industrialization. And that is correct. We actually looking at that. We mentioned it in the paper, but we didn't go deeper. We just mentioned it to illustrate that at each historical conjuncture that there is an attempt to industrialize, there's always some pain or some dispossession that happens. But we didn't actually look at the politics of this Volta Dam and the politics today of industrialization based on the offshore industry, petroleum industry. But what is beginning to come clear, and as other scholars have analyzed the general industrialization policy of Ghana, is that the political class are not actually that determined like Nkrumah was determined to industrialize Ghana. So you have all these good policies on paper, but they are not implemented. So in terms of politics, you have the politics of rentierism rather than the politics that promotes industrialization. Of course, the petroleum industry is clearly an industry that is a money-making industry with corruption and other acts of bad politics that you can see in Ghana. So that definitely is an important point to look at the politics of the Volta Dam and then the politics of industrialization based on Ghana petroleum industry. There's also a question concerning the fisher folks before dispossession, what they were doing, how did they diversify their lives and the success and failure of that. Yes, fisher folks everywhere in the world do not, just like peasants, are always into livelihood diversification. So before the oil industry, these fisher folks were actually dependent mainly on fishing, but as we indicated, they also depend on some, small-scale farming as a backup or as a form of diversification of their livelihoods. So the success in doing that, at least before the oil industry, they thought they were doing just well. It is just after the oil industry that they began to complain about how their income has reduced, how their catches have reduced, and all those complaints that are related to dispossession and ocean grabbing and land grabbing. And to some extent, it is true based on what we saw on the ground through our ethnographic work. Dennis, also from UDS, asked whether there are alternative livelihoods provided. Yes, the oil companies try to provide alternative livelihoods in terms of breeding or rearing fish as an alternative livelihood. They also provide certain what they call corporate social responsibility and all that. But as you can hear from the voices of the fisher folks, that is not enough. And one can understand them when it comes to fishing and farming, and when it comes to the ocean and people's attachment to all these things. It's more than just livelihoods. It has some deep cultural implications. So people like to fish, so you might provide them a ground for breeding tilapia and all that, but they won't take that to be enough. I think those are some of the things that I have read online. I think Sadahat was talking about other elements of the blue economy that exist in Ghana. Yes, we already indicated that the small-scale fishing industry is part of it. You have industrial fishing. Of course, you have transportation, that is the ship that dock on Ghana's shore, and trade. All these are part of the blue economy in Ghana, but the focus of this paper is on the offshore petroleum industry. And you were also concerned about whether the state is able to mediate between different fractions of capital on the blue economy. It goes back to the capacity of the state. And as in Agrarian political economy, the state capacity is very, very important in the way it is able to link or to make those connections or to make those linkages between agriculture and industry by drawing surplus from agriculture to feed industries, by drawing funds from agriculture to feed industry. The same way is expected of the state in Ghana to mediate between these all different fractions of capital on the the blue economy. But we have illustrated clearly that the nature of state that the form of state that we have in Ghana, it is highly incapacitated to do that. And for that matter, the power of capital has trumped over the autonomy of the Ghanaian state. So I'll leave the rest to Jesse to take up.
Thanks. And maybe, Thintiba, while this wasn't a direct answer to your question, it maybe answered it sort of in a way, but we will return to that as well. Jesse.
Sure. Yeah, I'll also try and I'll give the direct answer to Jasper's colleague, which is, I mean, in classical, Marxian analysis of imperialism, the economic surplus is extracted and it's brought abroad, right? That's colonialism. What we're talking about, the main difference is we're hoping that this surplus is going to be reinvested in industrialization domestically. And that's the kind of transformation ideally we would like to see. So I think that's the most simple, direct answer to what you're asking. Again, I don't know that we're necessarily saying that we are advocating for capitalist development, but what we are seeing is a situation now where Ghana as a whole, and in particular, the peasantry is experiencing all the negatives of capitalist development, all of the dispossession, all the dislocation, and they're not seeing any benefit, even the kinds of benefit that we've seen in other parts of the world in terms of rising standards of living, employment, and so on. And that, I think, links very directly to the question I think it's Gaurav asked about employment, the scale of employment, and so on. And it is obviously the oil industry has not contributed a great deal to employment. Contributed much more to GDP. I think we have figures in our other article in the Journal of Modern African Studies of employment of a couple of thousand formal jobs. But as I've been arguing earlier today, the informal or the secondary linkages that could be created would be multiples of that, hopefully, if industrial policy is well implemented. And I also want to pick up on that a question of alternative livelihoods and our oil companies providing alternative livelihoods, because I always found it so interesting that companies like Tullow in Ghana would very directly have social investment programs, corporate social responsibility that they call alternative livelihoods. Training on, as Jasper mentioned, fish farming and activities like that, because to me, that's almost an acknowledgement that livelihoods are being affected, which the companies are not willing to directly make if you ask them about that, but they are providing alternative livelihoods in the Western region. So that's an interesting contradiction in and of itself, but it's on a scale that's not, remotely addressing the impacts that are being felt in the Western region, right? I mean, corporate social responsibility is not a meaningful response to dispossession. The state reinvesting some of that surplus in those regions might be a more meaningful response than social investment, right? Trying to address the inequality, trying to return some of that surplus to those communities and attempt alternative livelihoods on a larger scale would be investing in education, investing in new industries. But we haven't seen that either on the kind of scale that would be required to address or compensate for the dispossession. I don't know if we're seeing adequate compensation at all for the dispossession. I mean, we're not. But theoretically, you could imagine the state, if it's a progressive industrial policy, at least attempting to do that and mitigating some of the most negative impacts of an industrialization plan like that. Maybe I'll see if there's more questions after that.
Well, I put myself on the list of people to pose questions to you now, and it also relates to the industrialization, or the fact that there is a policy which, if it were implemented regarding local participation, would have major impacts. So that's great, and that of course means that one can use that politically and say there is a pathway here that the government should be pressured to do, etc., etc. But if we think of ourselves also as academics, figuring out what goes on the ground, what the interests are, how likely it is to happen, then I'd like to ask you the question: how likely is this to happen, and what do you base your analysis on? Why? So my question is really, why would the government and the dominant classes want to do that? What is the indications that they may want to do this? And I'm asking this in the context of also saying, how common is this that dominant classes do that? As far as I understand situations both in Ghana and elsewhere, there's a focus today by more so-called progressive governments to support, to provide a social floor for the working poor, but not to interfere in markets and change how markets work, because you do not want to disturb global capital and what they want. And maybe you're quite happy to go with global capital and being part of getting the rentier incomes from that. And I'm not talking Ghana here. I know very little about Ghana. I'm talking when I think of the Latin American experience in the early 2000s, when I think of major parts of Asia, India, Indonesia, there hasn't been a proper drive towards industrialization. There's been a proper drive towards growth, but where the money went afterwards were not really a concern for the government. And it didn't lead to, for example, in India, high growth rates led to jobless growth, and today job loss growth. So even if it did lead to growth, why would it lead to the kind of growth that is beneficial for working poor? So it's two questions here, and it's really about your political analysis, because you have set up, this is what we would like to see would happen, this is what they claim would happen, but it isn't. So why is that, and what is your understanding of the interests that are pushing the development, and therefore what might happen?
Should I take this one first, Jasper, or do you want to go?
Yeah, you go.
Okay. Well, my knee-jerk reaction is it's not that likely. The historical evidence we've seen of maybe 10 to 20 years of local content policies in the petroleum industry in various African states suggests that at best it's going to be marginally developmental, right? And perhaps in the countries I've devoted most of my attention to, Angola, Nigeria, the big oil producers, you could make that argument. Ghana has additional challenges because of the size of its petroleum resources that are not at the same level. And it doesn't have decades of experience in the oil and gas industry that would, equip a small number, but a small number of citizens, hopefully, with the skills and experience they would need to be, entrepreneurial or to be capitalist. So that's one concern. Obviously, when we're talking now about oil and gas as a mechanism for development, we also have to think about the sustainability of development on the basis of fossil fuels. So that's another reason to not be overall terribly optimistic about this. But on the other hand, what I also want to say is, and this goes to your question of what would, convince the dominant classes to buy into a system like this, what would convince them is if it was more beneficial than the rent seeking they'd previously been engaged in, right? And you could imagine the development of local content being more beneficial from a perspective of elite accumulation than the kinds of rent seeking that they were engaged in previously. And that's the hope that I'd had, that I think Jasper had as well, about the potential of local content policies. And I would just end by saying that as unlikely as this approach, this developmental state approach seems, this is the approach that I believe has worked in every situation of late industrialization that we have seen in the world. So that's the hope, that if they're not getting it right now, and if they're not getting it right through their oil and gas industry, through this set of local content policies, that this is still the approach that we've seen time and time again can lead to industrialization, that will not immediately improve everybody's lives in terms of an equitable pro-poor strategy, but that will have a developmental impact, whereas previously there was none. That's what I would say.
Thanks so much. Jasper, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, just to add to that is the historical perspective that Bridget was pointing out to us. I don't know, is my connection come? Is it? Yeah, okay. So you can know why it might not happen, like JC has pointed out, from the historical perspective of the political class and their attitude or their way of their understanding of development separate from their own political interests. So I mean, there's a sense in which the new crop of politicians in Ghana are totally different from the Nkrumah, despite his problems. Clearly was somebody who was determined to promote industrialization. But this crop of politicians, two dominant parties, NDC and MPP, both leaders, actually they really talk about and have all these nice policies on paper about industrialization, not just with respect to the oil industry, but even in the classical agrarian political economic approach of industrializing based on agriculture. All these policies have been there. In the case of gold that has been mined before oil, there have been all these nice policies of how do we add value to the gold, how do we add value to the cocoa, and all those things that have been, parroted throughout history after Nkrumah's period, but nothing has happened. So clearly we have a case of what you said, the oil industry promoting growth, but this is jobless growth. And in that case, the Agrarian political economic analysis will come in here, considering the class differentiation and the class formation and reformation that are beginning to happen. As Kaplan pointed out, the conflict between different classes. What to make of that? I mean, should we be thinking about bottom-up politics of resistance, and for that matter, Angel's political approach to the Agrarian question of these dispossessed, mobilizing to resist, and we saw a bit of that during our work, with most of them very, very angry because of the jobless they were dispossessed without jobs being created. So that is another area, the politics of the dispossessed, I mean, where it is going, considering that the industrialization aspect is not working. Because as we talk now, Ghana is going through economic crisis, one of them being the motor driving this, or the major factor being fuel. The prices of fuel have tripled, quadrupled, and they are besides themselves. They don't know what to do. Yet it is a net exporter of crude oil. So I mean, these are some of the contradictions that one is looking at from going forward with this research.
Thanks so much. The line isn't totally good, Jasper, but I think we all got what you were putting forward. Now we do have to finish very soon, but you will see there is a great little piece from Irish in the chat explaining various aspects that you might want to read and comment on, and thanks for following the chat so nicely as you've done. And Christopher K would like what turns out to be the last question of the day.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed. Sorry, I arrived a bit late to the presentation, 10 minutes late for other reasons, but I enjoyed enormously the presentations, the various questions, and particularly your very thorough and appropriate answers. And my point, I just want to make a general comment in the sense that I very much agree with the idea that developing countries need to develop a strong developmental state. I think that is established. Neoliberalism doesn't lead you to much development. It needs to be a developmental state which has the support of the wider population and which can create more support through its development policy. And what I'm surprised that you focus so much on industrialization, because looking at the case of South Korea and Taiwan, which I've analyzed once in comparison to the development of Latin America in an article of Journal of Peasant Studies, and which I'm revisiting now in a new book on land, which June and Jenny are editing for the Oxford Handbook on Land. I'm developing further these ideas. For me, the key in this is to develop the linkages. And you can create linkages all over the place. And for that, you need to have a clear development strategy where you create the linkages, not only agriculture industry, like historically, but also industry service, agriculture service, and so on. You have to create to maximize the linkages, and you have to find out where you can maximize the linkages and to have a certain sequence in which the state then brings about these linkages, a certain sequence over time, and you have to have a clear idea about this. And of course, the ability for that state to stay in power and to gain the support, because these are long-term development projects. This sequence, to bring out the sequence, requires a long-term development strategy. And for that, you need not constant changes of government and changing of plans, but to stick to certain key ideas and key development. But Carlos Oya wrote also a paper which I think appeared only in a working paper on Africa, actually, and he presents a very nice model of the multiple linkages that you can create through all these economic sectors. Why just industry? No, yes. Service is so important today. So you must higher education, so on and so forth, which has less negative ecological impacts and so on and so forth. So this is just an idea to pursue further. But I loved very much your presentation and the whole discussion, and the points also raised by Jens at the end. They're all appropriate, and I wish you good luck. And of course, it's difficult, and South Korea and Taiwan was a special case, but we still can learn some lessons from it. Thank you.
Thanks. And could I ask for last brief comments from you two authors? because we are running out of time.
Jesse, go.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent point about services. We wouldn't want make our analysis to the exclusion of the possibility of job creation and linkages in the services sector. I think we still have an idea that economic development and improvement in the standard of living, like good quality jobs, would require industrialization in Ghana, and particularly, more heavy industry and in some areas that are more easily linked to the oil and gas industry. But services are certainly important. On the comment from Iris, I'll just mention as one of our research assistants. So I view this more as adding some detail about what we actually found in the research. That's very helpful. That we did explore some of the hierarchies in these communities and the aggravation that was occurring over feeling that other people were benefiting, but that you weren't benefiting. I guess I'll probably stop there. Let Jasper have the last word.
Yeah, I just case point is very well taken. Not just to focus on industries like heavy industries, but service areas. Even connection service to, like insurance and research and all that can be a form of linkages. It's interesting, he talked about South Korea, which is one of the countries that Ghana is always compared to really illustrate the way in which Ghana has really lagged behind South Korea, taking into consideration that they were at the same level of development in the 1960s. So that's an interesting comparison that can be made. And like you pointed out, Aris is just who was one of our research assistants and who actually wrote a dissertation on the oil industry using the livelihood approach. It's just reminding us of how women are also gravely affected because they also own boats. And the fact that even corporate social responsibility services are also affected by these power structures in which some people in the community benefit and others don't benefit, and all are part of the class analysis and then the power relations that Agrarian political economy offers for analyzing all these issues. So I think with that, that is all that I can add to what Jesse has said. Thank you.
Yeah,
thanks. So
I just want to stress these development strategies. It's important to have this idea of synergy, as I see that one creates the dynamics to the interlinkages, creates a synergies, and it's a sort of a positive circulation and positive interrelationships, which create increasingly more wealth and more positive investment and so on. It's a synergy which is important in this multiplicity of linkages.
Chris, we will have to have you on when your publication is getting ready. But for today, I will thank Jasper and Jesse for this excellent presentation and for this wonderful discussion we've had that really has I think deepened the understanding of the work you're doing and your argument. Also Liam for helping us getting there through his excellent introduction to the discussion, and of course everyone else that have taken part in the chat and by raising questions. Thanks. It's been a pleasure. All that is left for me to do, apart from clapping, is to let you know that our next Agrarian Change seminar is 2 weeks from now, on the 17th of November. We stay at the same continent. We have Sarah Stefano from SOAS talking on the expansion of ultra-processed food and social reproduction in Africa, emerging questions. That is 2 weeks from now. But for today, for now, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, Jasper. Just to say that I send you the link. Okay, so I'll see you in 10 minutes, guys.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.